Classical archaeology has traditionally focused on the big finds, monumental buildings, temples, statuary, and villas. These finds are dramatic and have created some of the most famous elements of the landscape of classical Greece and Rome. But they also give a skewed vision of the ancient world because the big finds only represent a small sliver of ancient life, that of the elite populations and oftentimes those who have colonized regions distant from their own. Peter von Dommelen, professor of archaeology at Brown University, has spent his career searching for evidence of the rest of the population. By focusing on the rural life and agricultural practices of these peoples, he has begun to uncover the other side of ancient societies, the colonized rather than the colonizers. By focusing on the majority, non-elite, and rural populations, Professor Dommelen has been able to glimpse indigenous populations in Sardinia at different time periods, and thus reconceptualize the ancient world of colonization of the island. By looking through a much more complex kaleidoscope lens, his work helps to fill out the way we understand the ancient landscape beyond the large monuments. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. So welcome, Peter. I thought we'd start out with just a kind of basic question about your interest in archaeology. So can you tell us how you got started in archaeology and what drew you to it?
What drew me to it? I'm just a general interest, I think, in the past. But archaeology, I got hooked on it, I think, at high school. Because, I should actually, in that sense, backtrack a moment. I'm from the Netherlands. That's where I grew up, particularly in Flanders, basically on this. And my first excavation was when I was 16 or 17 in a medieval monastery in Flanders. So that was just half an hour's drive from my home. And I went there for 2 weeks, I guess. That just got me. There was a possibility of volunteering. I'd seen that. Oh, that sounded interesting.
Yeah.
And from there, I think I've more or less done fieldwork every summer.
Wow, since 16, yeah. That's amazing that it started that early. I didn't realize you were into it at that point, or had the opportunity even at that point.
Well, yeah, it's the opportunity. It's the area growing up, of course. There. Well, although I must say, here in the US, there's plenty of older and more recent archaeological sites. But that was in that area. There was an interest, and it was just we happened to hear of it, and there we go.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of doing high school level archaeology, and it just sounds like a great way to get people started in the field.
So then I was really just interested in classical antiquity in general. But because, archaeology I grew up in a rural area. And what do you know? I'm the first in my family as well, go to university. So what about archaeology and job prospects? And so I went to study classics, which at that time, classical archaeology in Leiden in the Netherlands, that was classics in general. So that was all the fields. And so also including archaeology. And, and I ended up doing the whole philology side, so including teacher training. I did some high school teaching and didn't quite think that I was interested in. But in the meantime, in Leiden, there had been a reorganization of all the archaeologies. Leiden has always been famous or really good at far away minor sort of cultures and languages. And many of those, past and present, had archaeologists attached to them, and in that time, and so we're talking late 80s, they brought all those archaeologists together in a sort of large institute, and so that created all sorts of options, and so I went that way.
Wonderful. So eventually you made your way to Sardinia. Most of your work lately, at least, or last 30 years or so, has been there. How did you get involved in Sardinia, and why?
I started working in Italy because I already through private family holidays had been in Italy already, so I spoke Italian already a little bit. And at university, I'd done more of it, and so my undergrad work was on Etruria, where I'd been excavating with the University of Florence. And after I graduated my undergraduate degree, I spent a year in London in anthropology. And there, in the meantime, my former archaeology advisor and somebody else were starting a project in Sardinia, and they were looking for somebody as a grad research student assistant to be involved in that project. And since I had sort of in the period experience and fieldwork experience, and that was relevant, they said, well, would you want to come? And so one of the faculty members is from Sardinia. And so they wanted to go to some place that was not Greek or Roman in the other Mediterranean. And that sort of in a way also set a lot of my interests actually sort of go back to that.
Had there been a lot of digs when you went in Sardinia? Or?
Oh, yeah. No, Sardinia, in general, fieldwork there is the usual, I think, in the late 18th century, early 19th century. That's what with, antiquarian travelers, and particularly because it's one of those sort of perceived as one of those wild places of the Mediterranean, off the beaten track. And so there's travelers' accounts. And because the archaeology, the nuraghi, these big stone towers, are very visible, so people were reporting on those. But the first sort of more professional archaeology took place after the Italian unification, so after 1862, sort of in the 1870s, 80s, that sort of took off. Some Sardinians, but also at that point, many mainland Italians who were coming over.
So one of the things that struck me about your work is that it's not focused on the big monumental sort of finds, but on trying to reconstruct rural life. So can you tell us what that entails and why you're doing?
It's really an interest to more in people in a way than in things. That's where the year of anthropology that I did in London, and I've always, and then the person I studied with in London, Michael Rowlands, remained a co-advisor during my PhD. So I've always been close. Well, that's why I'm now co-appointed as a professor of anthropology as well at Brown. That sort of going back and forth is something that I find really interested in and value. And at the same time, then there's, beginning to realize in classical archaeology as part of archaeology, that is actually, this is something that started in the 1970s, 80s. You had that. There's in Roman archaeology, there's Peter Garnsey who writes early about it. And it's even the Anthony Snodgrass, his Sadder Lectures book from the late 80s. So people were beginning to notice that when sort of in wider archaeologies, there was a sort of a broader interest that classical archaeology kept this very narrow, many people, well, and I would say as well, focus on elite material culture. There was all these things about the countryside being empty, only everything that is of note happening, happens in cities. But particularly if you think about it anthropologically, theoretically, and also sort of at that point from a theoretical Marxist perspective, if you think, all those people producing mosaics and statues and kind of things, they need to be fed somewhere. In a pre-capitalist economy, they're not going to be fed by urban industries.
Right.
And so that's what I thought, no, there's a big gap there in classical archaeology. And in that sense, I think you might have noticed me switching between classical and Mediterranean archaeology. I think I try to use those terms in a slightly different way, classical archaeology being the sort of conventional, traditional focus. And that's not to disparage it. It's really to bring out that there's more beyond Greece and Rome in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I mean, a similar phenomenon happens in what used to be, hopefully, ending biblical archaeology field, where
exactly
they want the big finds that match something in the Bible. But the more interesting thing is finding, to me at least, is finding information and building the world that, produced the Bible rather than just the big biblical finds. That's something that is sorely lacking in my field, and it sounds like something that you're working against.
Well, sort of trying to. I'm not going to change this on my own.
Yeah.
But you need to start somewhere. And apart from that, I think it's also satisfying because you sort of guaranteed to get results.
Yeah.
Although at the same time, there's also that's important. Well, you've seen it in my lecture, some of those slides of those farms. They, to put it mildly, they don't look terribly impressive.
Yeah.
You just have, some coloring in the sand because even houses built of mud brick, when the mud brick sort of falls apart, there's actually not much that remains. Although if you know what you're looking for, and if you're careful, you can actually see that very well if the conditions of the terrain are right. They may have stone sockles, stone bases, those walls, but in very in areas where where you're not building on bedrock immediately or so, there may not be stones, and people will rob out stones and use those. And so you're not left with much.
Yeah.
So that makes it also, that's part of the explanation why rural archaeology has had less intention. And then there's also the sort of the idea of agriculture is one of those things you cannot excavate, which is not true. You can excavate it, but or nowadays we can, and so to sort of all those things together that make it really interesting as well. And that sort of gets you to one of the other things that I like in archaeology, the interdisciplinarity. Sort of the one point you're talking to historical agronomist, and then with a soil scientist, and then somebody comes around who does remote sensing or so, and that's really just interesting.
Yeah, well, in unpacking what people grew and ate, it's the basis of the economy in the ancient world.
Yeah.
So that's the big picture, but also the smaller picture of just how people lived on an everyday basis and what they were interested in, what they were capable of doing. The technology wasn't what we have, but they were very capable people that did amazing things with what they had.
Precisely, and also the sophistication that is already much earlier. So, there's often an idea that before the Roman period, not much happened, or even before the Middle Ages, it wasn't all that much. The idea of Roman peasants just scraping by and sort of hanging by their fingertips on the edge of famine. That's totally not the case, which is not to say that people were having a great time.
Right.
But, quite a few did fairly well. Others did live on the edge of poverty or precarity. And that is now also being recognized much more broadly. There's a few more scholars, particularly in the Roman world, who are paying much more attention to these topics. But yeah, that's something of the last.
Yeah. How do you get at, other than the excavating agriculture, how do you get at those non-elite populations through archaeology? What are some of the ways that can recognize how the non-elites lived on a day-to-day basis? Well,
first, I think one of the main things, given the history of the discipline, is just excavate in different places.
Yeah.
And places where people say, well, there's nothing there, still go there. And in that sense, archaeological survey has been really important. That really in the Mediterranean started in the 70s with the famous Minnesota expedition in Messenia. But it really took off in the 80s, 90s. And so that was also my undergraduate thesis, was about working with data from a survey in Etruria. And much of my PhD work is also based on survey work. Mm-hmm. And validating, going back into archives, it's legacy data that's sort of still there. Because in the Mediterranean, wherever you go, there's easily a century of research. And there's such a wealth of data that you need to look for it. And of course, it's imperfect data. But, if you put a ton of imperfect data together, you can get things out of it. Or you can use it if you combine it with really well-focused, fine-grained contemporary work. You can use the latter to calibrate the mass of imperfect data. And I think you can go a long way in that sense.
Kind of along these lines, you've focused some of your work, especially lately, on indigenous populations in Sardinia, and trying to reconstruct their role in interaction with colonizing populations like the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans. So can you unpack that a little bit, what you're doing there?
Yeah, well, I'll go back here a little bit because, as you said, I've been working since my PhD days, so since the early 90s in Sardinia, doing field work. And my PhD was about sort of colonial presence, impact, colonialism in the first millennium. So Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, or Roman Republic. And that sort of very quickly sort of centered around the question. So what happens with, say, Carthaginians, who are the colonizers in the 6th century, 5th century, but then fast forward Punic Wars and they're suddenly on the other side. So have they become indigenous? Well, and then so much of it, the term local is therefore very important. And at that point, that was already a question that I grappled with. And it's also, there are classical sources talk about Carthaginians bringing in Libyo-Phoenicians, North Africans, as convicts and otherwise forcing them to migrate to Ibiza, to Sardinia in particular. And so to what extent are people local? To what extent do we actually get migrants from overseas? And can we actually see that in the archaeological record? Because the idea that, a Greek shirt signifies a Greek person is has long been abandoned, sort of mostly.
Yeah.
That's something I've long worked on, and gradually, and that's everything to do with contemporary discourse changing as well. And with me moving to the US and living in Rhode Island, where European colonialism in North America, at least, sort of had its start. And so living in those areas where, events like King Philip's War and as they're from the colonial side, as they're called, that sort of made me reflect on how can we see that in the Mediterranean we don't have the direct descendancy as we see here in the Americas, but that doesn't mean that the Mediterranean has never had indigenous people.
Yeah.
It also sort of calls into question and those are debates that sort of go around here in the New World as well, sort of, is indigeneity an absolute concept, or how do you go with it? Look at the Southwest, the Pueblo communities, the Navajos who come in later. And so, yes, of course, people have always been going around, sort of starting with out of Africa, sort of, if anything, people are, on the move in one way or another. It just depends on what scale you look at that. And so, but indigeneity, being native indigenous, has a lot to do, has more to do with how people see themselves than their, whether they're really the first. And because certainly this question, if you just look in our modern world, being the first in an area is the source of a big number of very bloody conflicts. Yeah. And so it's clear in the modern world that that's not a great criterion. And so why should we be using that in the past? Although it is, of course, people use it in the modern world and in the past, and both communities, societies who define themselves as indigenous use that element as well. So that it's a matter of perception, and that's the whole shift. So it's not about dismissing or accepting a claim being first in a place. It is about taking seriously how people see themselves. And in many ways, we can see that in the archaeological record as well, where people living. There's a great example in historical Greece that I think Hamish Forbes has highlighted, that when Albanian Ivrites migrants in 18th, 19th century or so moved into central Greece, small groups, they found rural Byzantine churches in the countryside that had never had settlement. They were really sort of isolated rural Byzantine churches. And that's why they started living around, because that was an element that they recognized, the Byzantine church and the liturgy, or at least the material side of things. That's what they recognized. So that seemed a familiar point where you could live rather than just on, otherwise all those hilltops or valley bottoms were new to them. And so that was not the point. So it's how people relate to their landscape. And that's another big anthropological, archaeological discussion about landscape. Landscape is not just a bunch of hills and trees. Mm-hmm. It's a whole social concept, how people live in there. And if we, with those landscapes, with those theories and perspectives, I think there's a whole lot that can be done in archaeology.
I taught a course last fall on origins where that conversation was, we had that continually, where who was there first, but then also how people look back for meaning in those earlier moments of their group's identity. And, the more and more we got into it, the more we realized how the conversation was, or that question of origins was really fraught, because there are some peoples that made up their origins as a way of kind of grounding their authority in the present. And that we saw that repeatedly. Mm-hmm. And that still happens. People make up stories about the beginnings to justify what they're doing in the present.
Precisely. No, and it's in fact in the classical tradition, it's something very big. Just, going back to, of course, colonial things, is the Greek, the whole notion of the oikistes. That is, various scholars have clearly identified, some of those stories are obviously mythical, but also in cases where it seems more historic, it's just pretty clear that it was all made up. But at the same time, you need to sort of say, well, you can't just dismiss everything as made up, because it was true, it was serious for the people who made it up, so to say. And so if you want to understand and take people seriously, then you need to go back and forth, in a hermeneutical sort of way, almost, by not accepting at face value what people are saying, but at the same time still take them seriously, not just dishing or dismissing.
Right, right. Because it's always a combination of things. It's never just one or the other. So can you kind of follow that up with how you see your work on indigenous populations related to post-colonial theory and imperialism?
Yeah, well, that's sort of coming out of it, I think, in a pretty direct way. It is one of the key points of post-colonial theory is precisely switching perspective, moving away from the colonial perspective, the colonizers' perspective to the colonized. That was what Frans Fanon, not what we was all about, but it was a really important thing. It's also what Edward Said and many others have been writing. It's really, there is this whole group of people who are exploited. And that actually, from a colonial perspective, is usually happily admitted because, they're the ones doing the work. But that's where the conversation then stops. And I think from the post-colonial perspective, that's where you sort of begin and start looking, well, yes, okay, they were doing the work. How did they end up doing there? How were they compensated, treated in a fair way? Did they have their own? And so from there, it is the colonized are in colonial situations are sort of the main group. But again, if you start thinking about the complexity of colonial situations, because of the histories and prehistories of those colonial situations, there are people who are, 2-3 times colonized. Yeah. There's others, former colonizers who have become colonized.
Right.
And then there are others who just moved in or were forcibly brought in by Cairo. So, I was just, what I was saying earlier, those Libyo-Phoenicians brought in, I don't know, because there's only, I think, Diodorus Siculus or, one of those authors has perhaps one throwaway line about it. So we don't know any details, but you could, for instance, begin to compare it for a better understanding, say what the British were doing with indentured laborers they were bringing in from India into places like Kenya and Uganda in Eastern and Central Africa, or including in the Guyanas here in South America. And they come in semi-privileged, but also not quite colonialist. And that's perhaps sort of the key thing that scholars like Edward Said were trying to sort of make clear, or Homi Bhabha is somebody else, that there is no binary between colonizer and colonized. There's a whole range of shades of gray, and to make things worse or more interesting or more complex, depending who you want to call it, from a historical diachronic perspective that we are looking at, those shades of gray are not permanent either. They switch, or communities, societies sort of change colors if you want, or not colors, change shades.
Yeah.
And that's really complex. And I think that complexity we need to accept and work with. A great example, North Africa, that I spoke about, it is the Jewish population in North Africa. And so if by the time we fast forward to the French occupation in 1830-31, those Jews were not thrown out of North Africa in 1492 as they were out of Iberia. And in fact, many of those Jews, Andalusian Jews, were former ones who had lived in Iberia. And they had continued to live there alongside others. There had been Ottoman occupation, various other Islamic dynasties. That was just a really, really complex situation. And so are those people native, indigenous? In some sense, yes, but that's a clear case that group, the Jewish inhabitants there, who did not consider or present themselves as being indigenous.
Right.
And so, and all those sort of situations, I think, are sort of really interesting. And then because the French colonial authorities, because of the Jewish-Christian connection, they treated the Jewish inhabitants of North Africa differently than the Islamic Muslim inhabitants. Although they might have otherwise totally comparable backgrounds.
Right. Yeah, I see that in my field too. In Second Temple Judaism, the assumption is that any Jew who's living outside of Israel is considering themselves as displaced somehow. But, the example of Egyptian Jews said they'd been there for centuries and lived, very comfortably at all levels of society. I find it hard to believe that they thought of themselves as displaced. I don't know if they thought of themselves as indigenous, but I don't know that they ever wanted to go to Israel for any particular reason. They saw themselves as Egyptians, Egyptian Jews, but Egyptians, tied to the land.
And even then, it's easily imaginable that people or communities, particularly at the sort of general level, do consider themselves as displaced as a group, but not as an individual.
Right.
It's those, particularly so human perception is rarely consistent.
Yeah.
And self-perception particularly.
So your work as an archaeologist is almost like trying to find, in a practical way, enact post-colonial theory from the colonized perspective.
Yes, that's what I'm really just trying to do. And sort of that is through an anthropological perspective and material culture, obviously. And sort of coming back to sort of your much earlier question about it comes together with this as well. The not just indigenous, but the subaltern, to use that term. Archaeology is often the only way to actually say something meaningful about those people, about those communities, because, in the written sources, there's not going to be much, or it gets, if you look at the Latin, agronomic literature says nothing about people, it's only about the crops. Mm-hmm. And then Virgil and that sort of thing, or Hesiod, it's nostalgic and from an elite perspective. And so it's hardly, it's significant because it does say something about perspectives in those societies, but it's not a good source that tells you how people were living.
Yeah.
And so, archaeology is interesting, and the material culture, because also I find studying people, communities, societies through their material culture interesting because you get a different perspective on it. And particularly you get to some of the most human aspects of people is who say one thing and then turn around and do something else.
Yeah.
And you actually, particularly when you get into later periods where there's more sources, I think you cannot take those things at face value. And so the confrontation between what's written and what you see people did is just fascinating.
Yeah. I was in a conference session a few years ago on Greek religion, and after the papers had been given, we had about a 45-minute conversation among the panelists and the audience. And it was really a vibrant conversation about material remains of religion and talking through that. And at one point, one of the participants said, this is a great conversation, and I think we all are feeling how material culture can give us an immediacy towards how people actually practice their religion and maybe even experience their religion in a way that literature just can't. And because it's been worked over so much over the years. But when you have something that was excavated, and buried at a moment when people stopped using it, and now we dig it up and look at it now, it's almost like you're transported back to that moment in a sense.
Yes, but that's also what, yes and no. I will immediately follow up. But because, absolutely. I think that first point, the materiality of objects, that is what fascinates people. That's why as an archaeologist working, particularly, if you work abroad, which means you stay there sort of for a long period, especially in sort of my case and Sardinia, where I've been kept coming back. There's always a tremendous interest by the wider public to come and see things. And they always ask, what have you found? What's the best thing you ever found? And, that's a sort of usual question. But there's also when you see a pot, what I said earlier, you find this Greek pot in Sardinia, in Iberia. It doesn't mean it was a Greek guy or woman who went there. That is totally well possible because people traveled and, people went for commercial or perhaps just adventure or whatever reasons. Women traveled as well, perhaps less frequently, but that would not have been impossible. But that shirt could have been brought there by anybody. And it's so going back also again to colonial situations. So one of the terms that's been used in the wake of post-colonial theories about hybridity, sort of that combining those various things. And it is, you may find, and you do find hybrid material cultures, objects that it's a great example that we've had in Sardinia are indigenous large open bowls that are used in kitchen food preparation, these sort of things that have a certain pretty nondescript shape. And then there are much smaller Phoenician bowls that are more for individual eating. So they're much smaller, they have very correct shapes. And at some point you start finding these big preparation bowls, but in the shape of those Phoenician ones.
Oh, interesting.
So that's really, but what does that mean? And so yes, there's clearly been contacts and in that sense, but it doesn't mean that it suddenly has become Phoenician. So what you actually need to be looking at is not so much, at least that's what I would say, is the shape or the color or the fabric of the pot, but the use that was made of it. And, and that's where it becomes complicated again, because how do you find how people were using things?
Yeah.
And, but that is, you can Well, another great example in Montiato, that's an example I love. Colleagues of mine from archaeologists from Innsbruck have been digging for years at Montiato in the northwest of Sicily. And there they excavated a symposium room, which has a tremendously impressive, beautiful, if you want, attic symposium set. Everything there. But it also has a little room next to it that has some really ugly local cooking pots that people for a long time didn't quite understand. So I say, yes, cooking, but it's actually not, it's too cramped and it's not a kitchen there. And so they did some chemical analysis of the contents of those pots. They were brewing beer. Ah. So those people were drinking beer out of their calyx.
Yeah.
That's not what people expect. And so there was the assumption, these Sicilians, indigenous local Sicilians have gone Greek, they're Hellenized, and said, well, no, these things were prestige goods for them. So the meaning of that calyx and the crater, they had a crater as well, and there probably was some wine, there was some amphorae as well. But it's sort of it was on the one hand, you could recognize it as a symposium setup, where rituals perhaps not the word there, but a symposium, whatever.
Yeah.
But you would be misunderstanding what was going on there, because for the people who were participating, who were using those kilicas and that crater, they would see it in a different way. And again, that's where the temple at Segesta comes in. In Montiato, they didn't build a Greek-style temple, but they did this. Well, at Segesta, we don't know because things haven't survived it to the same degree.
Yeah, the materiality isn't self-interpreting necessarily. In your archaeology, you're digging up the past, obviously, but you're digging in the present day. How does this presentness affect the way that you do the work in the field, working with the local populations, or even the material that you find? How does it affect the people in the region that you're working with?
It affects you from beginning to end, as everybody, sort of every single project, because you needed permission to. You can't just go and start digging somewhere. So it goes from there. So you need to have your connections. Well, you need to build connections, get in touch with the right relevant authorities. There's things about what land can you. It's been usually very difficult, at least in Italy, to excavate on private land. If you want to do so, you need to get the permission from the landowner, and that might cost you money. But but even if it costs money, it costs you a lot more in terms of building social connections and getting people to agree with you. But it's also, you need support, because you're coming particularly when you come from abroad, you're coming in with a team of people, they need to be housed. And that's, sometimes there may be sort of tourist developments that are available, but they can also be very expensive. And so renting local houses that means, again, you need to get local connections in some place. And that's where you get into traditions, archaeological fieldwork, disciplinary traditions, conventions. In the Middle East, people work with workmen, which is still a sort of a much more sort of, colonialist looking, which it isn't necessarily today, but it still has. Well, in Egypt, you're actually required to hire local workers, because that's also the flip side. So it's way too easy to dish that as a colonial way of working, modus operandi. In other parts of the world, you just cannot do that, or it's not done, or you need to have tons of money to do. That's where it begins. And then, you live for a period in those places. And then it depends. There are plenty, and I think the majority of Western European and American projects, they're entirely foreigners who go there, spedizione, those sort of terms are still used. And those are not, I think, often the situations in which there are most connections with the local population. But, and it also depends. Some projects just run for a small number of years and then people move on. But particularly when there's those long-running projects, build up very, very close connections. And that is, and I think that's important, because you are excavating people's land, and whether it's legally their land or conceptually their land, that doesn't really matter. And so you need to take them seriously. And I think many, many projects have usually done that. So almost everybody has kind of an open day where people can come, they give a talk somewhere. And then I think from there, it depends how project members, project directors, how they deal with that. In my case, I've always found that really important. Also interesting is my anthropological interest that comes into it as well. It's also that in many parts of the Mediterranean, particularly if it's totally different if you're excavating in Rome or Naples. In a big city, there's so many regulations and it becomes, you need to deal with the local authorities and the mafia and what have you. But in rural context, it is very personal, and you can't just, at least sort of the areas where I've worked, you can't just sort of delegate the organization of, renting the houses. People want to rent the house to me, and so I can't just send in a grad student sort of, organize that. No, because I need to go there. I need to phone them, speak with them. And I only get phone numbers through other friends who then recommend, so there's a whole kind of a personal side to it, which at the same time is also an important, that's the only way how you can find housing. But it's also a way how you become embedded in the thing because, most of those houses are all paid cash in hand.
Right.
And so, but they want to be paid, of course, but that's not the topic of conversation. That's not what it's about. And so you need to go, and when I go and pay people, it takes at least an hour because you need to sit down, you need to drink, you need to eat something, and then a conversation about this, that, and the other, and somewhere in between some money passes hands. But that's not what the meeting is about. And it is that sort of, that's an important part of the connections thing.
Yeah. Well, we always like to finish with the question about what you would, how you would advise grad students and recent PhDs who are kind of struggling to find their way in academia, what advice you have or thoughts about that.
That's a difficult one because especially at the moment, because so many programs are pausing this year that already last year was a tough year and it's not going to be any better. So I think a good advice is try to combine what you're interested in because it's really important that you go and do something that has your enthusiasm, that you need to literally live with that topic for quite a few years. But at the same time, you also need to be somewhat practical and look at what, so like in our field, Mediterranean archaeology, you need to decide early on. And that's a discussion I always have with grad students right from the beginning. Sometimes, often even with prospective grad students, sort of think about where roughly would you in principle like to see? Do you like teaching? And so because the smaller colleges in the US here, that's where there's quite a few jobs, including for archaeologists. But if you want to do that, you need to make sure you have a decent background in the languages because in a small department or in a small group within a bigger department, you need to be able to contribute to that aspect as well. And so nobody can do everything.
Right.
And so you need to make some choices about those things. And that's what you always, so what I often also say, I never taught a full course on Phoenician or Punic archaeology until I came to Brown. because that wasn't really part of in an archaeology program or in a sort of more classical oriented program. There was always a part of it.
Right.
But never a full course. And so, okay, that's what it is.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us and best of luck on your continued work in Sardinia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it was a great conversation. Thank you.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. If you wish to support this podcast and the work of the Future of the Past Lab, click on the donate button on our website.